For years he had worked tirelessly to build his dream home. Every brick, every beam, every nail had a story behind it. He had always dreamed of a place where his family could feel safe, where they could grow together and where they could make memories that would last a lifetime. It wasn't just a house to him. It was a symbol of everything he had worked for, a symbol of perseverance, sacrifice, and hope. The house wasn't large, but it was perfect in its own way. The walls were painted in soft hues that made the space feel warm. The kitchen was filled with the smell of home-cooked meals, and the backyard had a small garden that was blooming beautifully each year. This place was his sanctuary. The neighborhood was quiet, nestled away from the hustle and bustle of the city, and it was exactly the kind of place he had always envisioned raising his family. His children had friends who lived just a few houses away, and his wife would often host gatherings with the neighbors. It was a community, a tight-knit group of people who had each other's backs. But all of that was shattered one evening, in the most unexpected way. It was late. The sun had already set and the house was quiet. The kids were in bed and his wife was curled up on the couch reading a book. He had just finished his dinner and was preparing to relax when the phone rang. It was a call he would never forget. The voice on the other end was urgent, frantic even, and for a moment he couldn't make sense of what was happening. His heart dropped as he heard the words, "Your house. It's been destroyed." The words didn't make sense. Destroyed? How could his home be destroyed? It was supposed to be safe. It was supposed to be untouched by the outside world. But the panic in the voice on the phone was enough to convince him that something had happened. He told his wife, who was just as stunned, and they both rushed out of the house. As they approached, the sight that awaited them was nothing short of a nightmare. Their home was unrecognizable. The front windows had been shattered. The walls, once so solid and full of life, had been torn apart. Furniture was overturned, and the contents of their personal belongings were scattered across the floor. It looked as if a storm had come through and left nothing in its wake. But it wasn't a storm. It was something far worse. It was the handiwork of vandals, people who had no regard for the life and the work that had been put into this place. He stood there, frozen, in shock. The emotions that coursed through him were a mixture of disbelief, anger, and sadness. How could this happen? Why? His mind raced with questions, but no answers came. His wife, who was beside him, was shaking with tears streaming down her face. She could hardly comprehend what she was seeing. She had poured so much of herself into this home, into making it the place where their family would thrive. Now it was all gone. He could hear the sounds of sirens approaching in the distance, and as they neared, the chaos only seemed to grow. Neighbors gathered around, their faces filled with sympathy, but there was little anyone could say. The man was numb. His eyes scanned the damage, the broken furniture, the ruined belongings, and the shattered windows. It felt like the world was crumbling around him, and all he could do was stand there, helpless. The police arrived soon after, taking statements from witnesses and trying to piece together what had happened. But the man didn't need to know the details. He didn't need to know who did it or why it happened. All that mattered was that his family's sanctuary had been destroyed, and now they were left to pick up the pieces. In the days that followed, the reality of what had happened set in. He filed reports with the police, but deep down, he knew that no amount of paperwork or investigation could undo the damage that had been done. His house, the place that was meant to be a safe haven, was now a reminder of his vulnerability. No matter how hard he tried to fix it, the feeling of loss lingered in every room, in every broken wall and in every corner of the house. Yet, amid the devastation, he found something that he had never expected. Strength. It came in the form of his community. His neighbors, who had witnessed the destruction, were quick to offer their help. Some brought food, others offered a place to stay, and a few even volunteered to help clean up the mess. The man, still in shock, had no idea how to respond. He was grateful, of course, but it was hard to process everything. His house was destroyed, and yet here were these people, strangers and friends alike, coming together to help him rebuild. The days turned into weeks, and while the damage was far from repaired, the man began to find some solace in the kindness of others. But there was still something inside him that refused to let go of the anger. He couldn't stop thinking about who had done this to his home. Who would do such a thing, and why? What could possibly drive someone to destroy the life and dreams of another person? The police had few leads, and although they promised to investigate, There were no real answers. The man felt helpless. He was left with a broken home, broken trust, and a growing sense of resentment. But even in the midst of all the pain and loss, he made a decision that would change everything. Instead of focusing on who had destroyed his home, he focused on what could be done next. He couldn't just sit around and wait for answers that might never come. His family needed him. They needed to feel safe again. They needed to rebuild not just their house, but their lives. So he started with the small things. He picked up the pieces of broken glass. He cleared away the rubble. He called in a contractor to assess the damage. Every step was painful, but it was a step forward. As the days went by, the house began to take shape again, but something was missing. The house might have been rebuilt, but something inside him remained broken. The truth was, he didn't know how to fix what had happened. How could he? How could you fix something as profound as the violation of trust? How could you rebuild a home that had been shattered? Not just physically, but emotionally as well. But what the man didn't realize was that the journey ahead of him would teach him more than just how to fix a house. It would teach him about the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the incredible ability of people to change when given a second chance. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was a journey that would take him somewhere he never thought possible. Back to a place where healing and hope could coexist with the scars of the past. Days passed, and life slowly began to return to a semblance of normalcy. The shock of what had happened still lingered, but the man had a plan. He wasn't going to let the destruction define him, nor was he going to let it break his family. He had always been a person who believed in the power of action. When things got tough, you did what you had to do to push through. And that's exactly what he was going to do now. His home needed rebuilding, and he needed to keep moving forward. But even as he began to pick up the pieces, something gnawed at him, a sense of unresolved anger. The destruction was one thing, but it was the thought of the people responsible that was eating away at him. Who were they? What kind of person would do such a thing? He wanted answers. He didn't know who they were or why they had done it, but he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let this slide. Not after everything he had worked for. Not after the pain it had caused his family. The police had made little progress in their investigation. They had interviewed a few neighbors, gathered some evidence, but there were no solid leads. The vandals had been careful, almost methodical in their approach. They left no trace, no fingerprints, and no clear sign of who they were. The police assured him they would keep searching, but it was clear that the investigation was going nowhere fast. Frustrated, the man took matters into his own hands. He started asking around the neighborhood, talking to anyone who might know something. He knew people had seen things, heard things. There had to be someone who had noticed something unusual. But no one seemed to know anything, and the more he pushed, the more it seemed like people were avoiding the subject altogether. He began to feel isolated, as if he were fighting this battle alone. The house was still in disarray, and despite the help from his neighbors, the emotional weight of the situation was becoming harder to bear. His wife, though supportive, was equally overwhelmed by the loss. The children, too young to fully understand, had begun to sense the tension in the air. They could see that their father wasn't the same. He was more distant, more consumed by something that he couldn't let go of. One afternoon, as he sat in the living room, staring at the damage that still remained, he felt a pang of hopelessness. His dream of a perfect home seemed like a distant memory, overshadowed by the nightmare that had come crashing down on them. He thought about the vandals again. He thought about how they had stolen so much from him. Not just the house, but the peace of mind, the safety that his family had once enjoyed. He didn't understand it. He didn't understand why anyone would do something so senseless. But then something changed. As the days went by, he started to notice something in the air, a shift in his own feelings. At first, it was subtle, just a fleeting thought here and there. He began to wonder, what if, instead of focusing on revenge or finding the culprits, he focused on something else? What if he could find a way to rebuild, not just the house, but the trust that had been broken? What if he could do something bigger than just getting justice? What if he could offer a second chance, not just to himself, but to those who had hurt him? It was a thought that felt impossible, even foolish. How could he even consider working with the people who had done this to him? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that the only way he was going to move on was to let go of the anger, to forgive. He didn't have to forget what had happened, but he could choose to rise above it. He could choose to rebuild not just his home but his spirit. The idea was radical, but he couldn't shake it. He was going to do something no one would expect. A few days later, he contacted the police. He asked them for the names of the vandals who had destroyed his home. The officer on the other end of the line seemed surprised by the request. "Are you sure you want to go down that road?" the officer asked. "You could press charges, get them arrested. They could face some serious consequences, but the man didn't want punishment. What he wanted was something different. "I want them to help me rebuild my house," he said, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he wasn't entirely sure how to describe. The officer was taken aback. "You want them to do what?" "I want them to help me rebuild my home," the man repeated. "I want them to work with me to fix the damage they caused. I want them to understand what they've done, and I want them to make it right." The officer hesitated. It wasn't a common request, and it certainly wasn't something the police were used to hearing. But after a long pause, the officer agreed to pass the message along. It wasn't something they could just force, but they would talk to the vandals and see if they would be willing to cooperate. Over the next few days, the man waited anxiously. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would they agree? Would they even care? Part of him worried that the idea was too idealistic, that the people responsible for the destruction wouldn't want anything to do with him, or with the house they had ruined. But he had made his decision. He couldn't change his mind now. Finally, the call came. The police had managed to arrange a meeting with the vandals. They had agreed to help, under the condition that it would count as part of their community service. They would be required to work under supervision, of course, but the man's idea had intrigued them. He had offered them something that no one else had, a chance for redemption. The man didn't know what to expect when he met them. He was nervous, unsure of how the encounter would go, but when they showed up, he was taken aback. They were young, probably no older than his own children. They looked uncomfortable, even ashamed. They weren't the hardened criminals he had imagined. In fact, they seemed more like lost souls than anything else. They stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to say or do. The man didn't know where to begin. The anger he had felt was still there, but now it was overshadowed by a strange sense of empathy. These weren't monsters. They were just people. People who had made a mistake, people who had hurt him, yes, but people who could change if given the right opportunity. "I don't know why you did it," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "But I do know one thing. I can't move on unless we rebuild together. Not just my house, but the trust between us. If you're willing to help me, I'll do everything I can to make sure you have a chance to make things right." The silence that followed was heavy. The vandals exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond, but eventually one of them spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "We'll help," he said. "We're sorry for what we did. We didn't think about the consequences." The man nodded, accepting the apology, though he knew that words alone wouldn't erase the pain. But this was the beginning of something neither of them could fully understand yet. The first step had been taken. They were going to rebuild together. The first day of work was the most awkward for everyone involved. The man had carefully planned how the day would go. He knew the house needed a lot of repairs, but more than that, it needed to be restored, emotionally and physically. The vandals had agreed to help, and now it was time for them to face the consequences of their actions. But as they all gathered outside the house, there was a heavy tension in the air. Everyone was unsure how to begin. The man tried to break the ice, though he wasn't sure how to. "We'll start by cleaning up the debris," he said, pointing toward the scattered pieces of broken furniture and glass. "Once we clear the mess, we can focus on rebuilding." There were no responses. The vandals just stood there, looking at the ground, their faces unreadable. The man could feel the nervousness coming from them, and to be honest, he shared it. It wasn't just about repairing walls and fixing windows. It was about something deeper. How would they work together after everything that had happened? How would the man feel about being in the same space with the people who had destroyed his life? After a long silence, one of the vandals, he was young, barely out of his teens, stepped forward. "I'll start with the glass," he said quietly. The man nodded, appreciating the gesture, though the words felt heavy. "Thank you," he muttered, unsure of what else to say. They all began working, the sounds of sweeping and picking up debris filling the air. It was quiet at first, each person focused on their task. There was a strange feeling to it, almost like a forced peace. The man didn't expect any miracles to happen that day, but he had hoped for something. some sign that they could all find a way to move forward. As the day went on, the awkwardness remained, but slowly, the man began to notice something shifting. The vandals, though initially reluctant, started working harder. They weren't just going through the motions anymore. They seemed to be putting effort into the work, as if they were trying to make up for what they had done. It was as if the house itself was pulling them in, reminding them of what they had destroyed. With each broken piece that was cleared away, it felt like a small part of the emotional weight was being lifted. One of the vandals, a girl with dark hair, picked up a large chunk of wood and threw it into the pile. She looked frustrated. The man didn't know whether it was because of the work or something deeper, but he saw the frustration in her eyes. She was angry. She wasn't just angry at him or at the situation. It seemed like she was angry at herself. He wondered if this was her way of dealing with her guilt. As the day turned to evening, the work wasn't anywhere near done, but it was a start. The house was a little cleaner, a little less broken. The man felt exhausted, but also oddly relieved. They had gotten through the day without any major issues. The vandals had done their part, and while it wasn't perfect, it was a step in the right direction. As the group gathered at the end of the day, there was a moment of silence. The man looked at each of the vandals. They were tired, but there was something else, something that wasn't there when they first arrived. It was a kind of vulnerability. They were all in this together now. They had seen the damage they caused, and now they were part of the process of fixing it. "I know this isn't easy," the man said finally, "and I'm not expecting you to fix everything right away. But I appreciate what you're doing." "I really do." The girl with the dark hair nodded. "We just didn't realize how much it would affect you," she said quietly. "I don't think we thought about it at all. We were just angry." The man didn't know what to say to that. He understood. He understood more than he let on. He had been angry too, but there was something different now. The anger he had once felt was starting to fade, replaced by something else. A quiet understanding. "I get it," he said after a moment. "You were angry, and maybe I was too. But I'm glad we're doing this. It's not just about fixing my house. It's about something bigger. It's about moving forward." The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was understanding. The vandals seemed to have opened up a little, and the man, in turn, had allowed himself to see them as more than just the people who had destroyed his home. They were young, confused, and lost just like anyone else. They had made a mistake, but they were trying to make it right. That was all he could ask for. The next few days followed a similar pattern. Each day they worked together. It wasn't always smooth, and there were moments when the tension would flare up again. Sometimes the man would catch one of the vandals staring at the damage they had caused, and he would see the guilt in their eyes. It was a difficult thing to witness, but it was part of the process. They needed to feel that guilt. They needed to understand the weight of their actions before they could truly change. One afternoon, as they were replacing a broken window, the man found himself talking to the young girl who had seemed the most distant. She was working silently, her hands moving quickly as she worked to secure the frame. He watched her for a while before he spoke up. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked softly. She didn't stop what she was doing at first. But then, after a long pause, she looked up at him, her face still serious. "I don't know why we did it," she said. "We were just angry, but I guess we didn't think it would hurt you. It's not like we wanted to do something that would destroy someone's life." The man nodded. He understood. Sometimes people acted without thinking about the consequences. Sometimes people lashed out because they were in pain themselves. "We all do things we regret," he said gently. "It's not about the mistake, but about what you do after. That's what matters." She seemed to take in his words, her eyes softening just a little. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I know," he said, "and I appreciate that." The work continued, and slowly the house began to take shape again. It was still far from finished, but it was no longer just a symbol of loss. It was becoming a symbol of change, of growth. The man could see the transformation in the vandals. They were no longer the same people who had walked through his door on that first day. They were more open, more vulnerable, and more willing to take responsibility for what they had done. By the end of the week, the man began to feel a sense of hope. It wasn't just about the house anymore, it was about the journey they had all been on. He wasn't just rebuilding the walls and windows. He was rebuilding the connections between them. With each day, the distance between them seemed to shrink. There were still moments of tension, still moments of doubt, but there was also something else. A quiet understanding, a shared sense of purpose. They weren't just rebuilding a house. They were rebuilding trust. By the time the second week came around, there was a noticeable change. The house was beginning to look like a home again, not just a shell of what it once was. The walls had been rebuilt, the windows replaced, and much of the furniture had been restored. It was still a long way from being perfect, but it was progress. More than that, it was the beginning of something else, a transformation that no one had expected. The man had grown more accustomed to working alongside the vandals. It wasn't easy, of course. Every day was a reminder of the pain they had caused. Yet as the days went on, the feeling between them shifted. The awkwardness was still there, but it was lessened. Now when they worked, there was a sense of teamwork, an unspoken agreement that they were all in this together. They weren't just repairing walls. They were repairing something much deeper. One afternoon while they were working in the garden, the young man who had spoken the most in the beginning approached the man. He was holding a hammer in one hand, looking like he wanted to say something, but unsure of how to begin. "Hey," he said, his voice quieter than usual. I just wanted to say something." The man looked up, wiping the sweat from his forehead. "What's on your mind?" he asked, setting down his tools. The young man shifted uneasily, his eyes on the ground. "I don't really know how to explain this," he started, "but I feel like I owe you more than just fixing your house. I can't explain why I did it, what we did, but it wasn't just your house we hurt. We hurt you, your family, and I don't know, it's been eating at me." The man listened quietly, taking in the young man's words. He had heard similar sentiments from the others, but this felt different. It was raw. It was genuine. It was the kind of apology that couldn't just be brushed aside. "I don't want you to feel like you need to say that just because we're working together," the man said after a moment. "But I appreciate it. It means a lot." The young man nodded, his shoulders slumping as if a weight had been lifted off of him. "It's just, I feel like I'm finally getting a chance to do something right. To make up for what I did." The man smiled slightly. "We're all trying to make things right one step at a time." There was a long pause, and then the young man spoke again. "You've got a lot of strength," he said quietly. "I don't know how you're doing it." "If it were me, I don't think I could forgive so easily." The man thought about that for a moment. "Forgiveness doesn't happen all at once," he said. "It's a process. And sometimes you can only do it when you see people trying to make things right. That's all I'm asking for." The young man seemed to digest those words, nodding slowly. "I get it. It's not about forgetting. It's about moving forward." "We're doing that now," the man agreed. They were moving forward, but not just with the house. They were moving forward in a way that none of them had expected. It wasn't just about fixing the physical damage that had been done. It was about rebuilding something much more fragile: trust. As the week went on, there were more moments like this. Conversations that felt more like real connections than forced exchanges. The girl with the dark hair, who had been the most withdrawn, started talking more. She began asking questions about the man's life, about his family, about what it was like to build something from the ground up. And as they worked, she started opening up about her own life. She talked about growing up in a broken home, about the anger that had driven her and the others to do what they did. It wasn't an excuse, but it was a glimpse into why they had acted the way they had. It was a way for the man to see beyond their actions and into their hearts. The house was beginning to take shape, and so were the relationships between them. The physical work, painting, hammering, fixing, was hard, but the emotional work was harder. There were still moments when the anger from the past would resurface, when the memories of the destruction were too fresh to ignore. But each time that happened, there was also a reminder of how far they had come. The progress in the house mirrored the progress in their relationships. One afternoon, the man decided to take a break. He stepped out onto the porch and sat down, watching the work continue. The sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the yard. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. It was a quiet peace, the kind that comes when you've fought through something difficult and come out the other side, scarred but stronger. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time since the destruction, he felt like they were going to be okay. One of the vandals, the girl with the dark hair, approached him. She was holding a paintbrush, and for a moment she just stood there looking at him. "I wanted to thank you," she said suddenly. The man raised an eyebrow. Thank me? For what? For giving us a chance, she replied. We were all messed up, and you didn't have to let us help. You didn't have to forgive us. But you did, and it means more than I can say. The man smiled, though there was a slight sadness in his eyes. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for me. I need to let go of the anger, and this is how I'm doing it. She nodded, her eyes softening. I think you're teaching us something. We've been through a lot, and maybe we didn't deserve a second chance. But you gave us one. And that's something. The man didn't have an answer. He wasn't sure how to explain it. But as he sat there listening to her, he realized something. This wasn't just about the house. This wasn't just about fixing what had been broken. It was about something deeper. It was about redemption, about growth, about the kind of strength it takes to heal from pain. The next few days felt different. The house was almost finished, but it was more than that. The work wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional. The vandals had become part of his story, part of the journey of rebuilding not just the house but his life. And in return, they had begun to rebuild themselves. The house, once a symbol of destruction, had become a symbol of something else, a chance to start over, to learn from mistakes, to heal. As the final touches were put on the house, the man stood in front of it and looked at what they had all created together. It was more than a building. It was a testament to what could be achieved when people came together, when they chose to forgive and when they chose to move forward. He looked at the group of vandals who had now become more than just strangers. They had become part of his journey, and as they worked side by side, he knew that the house wasn't the only thing being rebuilt. They were all rebuilding something inside themselves, something that would last longer than any wall or window. The final day of work had arrived. The house was no longer just a place of pain and loss. It was a symbol of something more. It stood tall and strong, its walls freshly painted, its windows sparkling. Inside, the rooms had been restored, the furniture replaced, and the small touches that made it a home were slowly being added back. It wasn't perfect, but it was more than the man could have hoped for when the destruction first occurred. He walked through each room, taking in the sight of it all. His home, his family's sanctuary, was back. But there was more than just physical restoration happening here. The work they had done together, him, his family, and the vandals, had been more than just about rebuilding walls. It had been about rebuilding trust, about healing from the wounds that had once seemed impossible to mend. Over the weeks, the tension had melted away. The anger that had once burned so fiercely in the man's heart had faded into understanding. He had forgiven the vandals not just with his words but with his actions. And in return, they had started to change. They had started to understand the weight of their actions and what it truly meant to make amends. They weren't just working to repair a house. They were working to repair the damage they had done to a person's life. The man stood in the living room, looking out the window. He could hear the sound of laughter coming from outside. His children were playing with the young man who had spoken to him the most. They were laughing, their voices light and carefree. The man smiled to himself. It was a beautiful sound, one he hadn't heard in weeks. The house was no longer just a place where they lived. It was a place where they could feel safe again. It had taken time. It had taken patience, forgiveness, and a willingness to move forward. But now the man could finally see the end of this journey. It was a journey that had started with destruction, but had ended with something far greater, a sense of peace. The vandals had been sentenced to community service for their actions, but the man hadn't seen it as just a punishment. It had been a chance for them to prove that they could change, that they could learn from their mistakes and do better. He had given them an opportunity to rebuild, not just his house but their own lives. And in turn, they had given him something in return, something he hadn't expected: redemption. He had watched them over the weeks, seen the way they had opened up, seen the way they had begun to take responsibility for what they had done. They weren't the same people who had walked into his home that first day. They had learned, they had grown, and most importantly, they had begun to see the world through a different lens. They had understood that their actions had consequences, and that those consequences could be faced and dealt with. They had made mistakes, but they were learning from them. The man walked outside where the vandals were finishing the last touches of their work. They had been working alongside his family, painting the porch, planting flowers, and making sure that everything was perfect. They weren't just doing it because they had to. They were doing it because they wanted to. The young girl, who had been the most withdrawn in the beginning, was carefully arranging pots on the steps, her face focused but peaceful. The young man who had first spoken to the man was hammering a final nail into the wooden fence. They were all working as if they had a personal investment in it now, as if this house was no longer just something they had destroyed, but something they had all helped to create. The man stood there for a moment, watching them. He didn't need to say anything. The work was done. The house was done, and as he looked at the vandals, no longer just the people who had torn apart his life, he realized that the true transformation wasn't in the house, but in them. "Looks good," the man said, breaking the silence. They all turned toward him, and for the first time, he saw no shame in their eyes, only a sense of pride. The young man who had spoken to him earlier wiped his hands on his jeans and walked over. "We did it," he said with a smile. "It's not perfect, but it's a lot better than it was." The man nodded. "It is, and I couldn't have done it without you." The girl looked up from her work, her face softening. "I just want to say thank you for everything. We didn't deserve it, but you gave us a chance, and that means a lot." The man smiled. He had heard their apologies, but this one felt different. This was the kind of apology that came from the heart, the kind that couldn't be easily dismissed. They weren't just apologizing for the destruction they had caused. They were acknowledging that they had learned something from it. They had grown. "You don't have to thank me," he said, his voice steady. "You've shown me what it means to take responsibility. You've shown me what it means to rebuild, and that's worth more than anything." There was a quiet moment between them, a shared understanding. It wasn't just about what had happened, it was about what they had all learned along the way. The man had learned that forgiveness wasn't easy, but it was necessary. He had learned that people could change, that even the darkest moments could be followed by light. And the vandals had learned that redemption wasn't something you could ask for. It was something you had to earn. It was something you had to work for, and sometimes it took a lot of work. As the last of the work was finished, the man stepped back and looked at the house once more. It was more than just a building now. It was a place that held memories of both the pain and the healing. It was a reminder of what they had all been through, and what they had all overcome. The group stood together, looking at the house, and for the first time since it had been destroyed, the man felt a sense of peace. He knew that this chapter was coming to a close, but he also knew that the lessons learned during this time would stay with him forever. The vandals, now more like young people who had made mistakes and grown, looked at him one last time. The girl who had been the quietest spoke up. "You gave us a chance. We won't forget it," the man nodded. "And I won't forget what you've done. You've rebuilt more than just a house. You've rebuilt trust." With that, they all turned toward the door of the house. It wasn't just a house anymore. It was home. It had been rebuilt, not just with nails and wood, but with understanding, forgiveness, and the willingness to move forward. And as the man stepped inside, he realized that this house wasn't just his home, it was theirs too. Months had passed since the house had been rebuilt, and life had started to settle into a peaceful routine. The man, his family, and even the young people who had once destroyed his home had begun to find their new place in the world. The house, which had once been a symbol of pain and loss, was now a symbol of growth and healing. It wasn't just the physical structure that had been restored. It was the connections between people, the bonds of understanding and forgiveness that had once seemed beyond reach. The young people, the vandals who had caused so much destruction, had continued their path of redemption. They had all served their community service hours, but the man knew that this wasn't the end. They had made a choice to rebuild, to change, and to move forward in their lives. While their past actions couldn't be erased, the man had seen firsthand how much they had grown. They had become a part of his story just as he had become a part of theirs. The man still kept in touch with them. It wasn't always frequent, but when their paths crossed, there was no awkwardness. There was a sense of camaraderie, a quiet understanding that the past had shaped them all into who they were today. They had learned lessons that would stay with them forever, and they had shared in something far greater than the simple act of fixing a broken house. One afternoon, the man received a call that would set everything into motion again. It was from one of the young people, the girl with the dark hair who had first approached him with an apology. Her voice was shaky, and he could sense the nervousness in her words. "Can we meet?" she asked, her tone hesitant. "Of course," the man replied. Is everything okay? I think so. I just need to talk to you about something, she said, her voice trailing off. It's about the future. The man felt a sense of unease, but he agreed to meet her at a local cafe later that afternoon. When they met, the girl looked different. She wasn't the same person who had walked into his life months ago. Angry, defensive, and closed off. Now she seemed more open, more confident, but there was still something in her eyes. A hint of uncertainty, as if she was still figuring things out. They sat down at a small table, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The man let her gather her thoughts. He could see she had something on her mind, but he didn't rush her. Finally, she took a deep breath and looked up at him. I wanted to say thank you again. For giving me that second chance, she began, her voice steady. I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain how much it meant. You didn't just give me a chance to fix your house, you gave me a chance to fix myself. The man smiled softly, but there was still something in her expression that made him pause. You've come a long way since that first day, he said. I'm proud of the progress you've made. She nodded, but her expression was serious. That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I've been thinking a lot about everything we've been through, and I know I'm not the only one who's changed. I can see it in all of us, but I also know that change doesn't stop here. The man listened closely, sensing that there was more she wasn't saying. I've been thinking about what's next, she continued. We've all learned so much from this experience. We've learned that actions have consequences, that redemption is something we earn. But what happens when we're ready to move forward? What happens when we've done everything we can to make things right, but we still feel stuck? The man leaned back in his chair, taking in her words. He could see the struggle in her eyes, the uncertainty that still lingered. You've come a long way, and it sounds like you're thinking about the future. But what do you feel stuck about? She hesitated, then spoke softly. I don't know how to move forward. I feel like I've changed, but I still don't know where to go from here. The past keeps coming up, and I feel like I can't escape it. The man understood. Change wasn't a one-time event. It was an ongoing process, and sometimes the past would rear its head, trying to drag people back into the mistakes they had made. I get it, he said gently. I don't think anyone ever truly escapes the past, but that doesn't mean we're stuck there. Moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. It means building on what we've learned. She nodded slowly, taking in his words. I feel like I need something more. I don't know what that is yet, but I know it's something, and I don't want to keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not. The man was silent for a moment, thinking carefully. He had seen this kind of uncertainty before, not just in her, but in others as well. It wasn't unusual for someone who had gone through such a transformative experience to feel this way. They had learned so much, but now they had to figure out how to apply those lessons to their future. You're right, he said finally. Change doesn't end. It's ongoing. You don't have to have all the answers right now. You just have to keep moving one step at a time. And when you feel stuck, ask for help. You're not alone in this. The girl looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, she said quietly. I don't know what's next for me, but I feel like talking to you has helped me see that I don't have to have everything figured out right away. The man smiled, his heart warm. None of us do. Life isn't about having all the answers. It's about learning to ask the right questions and finding the courage to move forward, even when you're not sure of the outcome. They sat there for a while, talking about the future, about their goals, and about the uncertainty that still loomed. The man offered her encouragement, reminding her that the journey she was on didn't have to be rushed. Sometimes the most important thing was to keep going, even when the road ahead wasn't clear. As they said their goodbyes and the girl walked away, the man sat back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had happened. He had given someone a second chance, and in return, he had learned more about forgiveness, about growth, and about the power of community than he ever could have imagined. It wasn't just about rebuilding a house. It was about rebuilding lives. And while the journey hadn't always been easy, the man knew that it had been worth every step. The house stood as a testament to that, but it was the people, each one of them, who had truly changed. They had all come together, built something stronger than just a physical structure. They had built connections, healing, and a future that was brighter than anything they had once imagined. As the man walked home, he couldn't help but feel a sense of peace. He knew the work wasn't done. There would always be challenges ahead, but he had learned one of life's greatest lessons. the ability to rebuild, not just walls, but hearts. Months continued to pass, and the seasons changed. The house, once a crumbling reminder of destruction, had become a beacon of hope, a place where memories of the past had slowly been replaced by new positive ones. Life had moved on, but the man never forgot the lessons he had learned through this long, unexpected journey. He still kept in touch with the young people who had once torn apart his life. It wasn't frequent, but each time they met, he could see how far they had come. One evening, as the man sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. It had been a long time since he had experienced this level of peace. The house was quiet, the children asleep, and for once he could just sit and reflect on everything that had happened. But his peace was interrupted by a knock at the door. He stood up, confused. It was late and he wasn't expecting anyone. When he opened the door, he was surprised to see the young man who had first spoken to him, one of the vandals standing on the other side. "Can we talk?" the young man asked, his voice uncertain. The man stepped aside to let him in, wondering what had brought him here at this hour. They sat in the living room, the same place where so much had changed. The young man was quiet, his eyes downcast as he seemed to struggle with his words. "I don't know how to say this," the young man began, "but I need to thank you for everything. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I truly understood what you did for me until now." The man smiled softly. "It's all right. You've come a long way since that first day." The young man nodded, his hands fidgeting with the edge of his jacket. "I don't think I ever fully realized how much of an impact we had on your life. I mean, I knew we messed things up, but I didn't get it. Not until recently. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I wanted to let you know something." The man looked at him, waiting for him to continue. "I've been trying to move forward," the young man said. "I've been trying to figure out who I am now after everything that happened. And I've realized that what you did, it didn't just give me a chance to fix your house. It gave me a chance to fix myself. I don't know if I would have ever figured out how to be a better person if you hadn't given me that second chance." The man felt a lump form in his throat. He had always known that the young people had been changing, but hearing this, hearing how deeply his actions had affected their lives, was something he hadn't expected. "I'm glad to hear that," he said quietly, "but you did the work. You're the one who made the decision to change." The young man nodded, but there was something else in his eyes, a hesitation that told the man there was more to this conversation than just gratitude. "Actually, that's part of why I came here," the young man continued, his voice growing more serious. "I've been thinking about the future, about my life. I've been trying to figure out how I can make up for everything, how I can keep going in the right direction. And I realized something." The man waited, unsure of where this conversation was headed. "What did you realize?" "I realized that I don't want to just move forward for myself," the young man said. "I want to give back. I want to help others the way you helped me. I want to be a part of something bigger than myself, something that can make a real difference." The man's heart swelled with pride. He had always hoped that the young people would take the lessons they'd learned and apply them in the world beyond this house. He had never imagined they would feel this deeply about their own transformation. "That's a big decision," the man said, his voice full of encouragement. "It's not an easy path, but it's the right one." The young man nodded, his eyes now shining with a sense of purpose. "I want to start by helping people who've made mistakes like I did. I know what it's like to feel lost, to not know where to go next. And I want to help them see that they can change too. I want to show them that redemption is possible." The man could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had given the young man a second chance, but now this young man was giving something back to the world, a chance for others to change. It was a full circle moment, a reminder that sometimes the most unexpected acts of kindness could ripple out into the world in ways no one could predict. "I think you'll make a real difference," the man said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm proud of you, and I'm proud of the person you've become." The young man looked down at his hands, then back up at the man. "Thank you," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you." The man smiled, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did the hard work. You made the decision to change. I just gave you a little push." There was a long silence between them, both of them taking in the weight of the moment. The man realized that what had started as a journey of personal healing had become something much greater, a chance to change lives, to inspire others and to show that no one was beyond redemption. I don't know what the future holds, the young man said quietly, but I know I want to help people who've made mistakes. I want to be a part of something that matters. The man looked at him, a feeling of peace washing over him. I think you're on the right path. You're going to do great things. They sat there for a while longer, talking about the future, about the plans the young man had, and about the changes he wanted to see in the world. The man couldn't help but feel a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just about fixing a house. It was about fixing lives. And now the young man was ready to help others rebuild their own. As the night wore on, the young man stood to leave. Thanks again, he said. I just wanted to make sure you knew how much you've changed my life. You're welcome, the man replied. And remember, change isn't a one-time thing. It's a lifelong process. Just keep moving forward. With one last grateful glance, the young man left, and the man stood in the doorway, watching him walk into the night. For the first time, he felt a deep sense of closure. The house was whole again, but more importantly, the people who had entered his life through tragedy had been transformed. They had all been given the chance to rebuild, and now they were passing that gift forward to others. As the man closed the door, he felt at peace. He had done something that mattered, and in the end, that was all anyone could hope for.